A wealthy man opens his doors to a homeless father and son, believing he's offering them a fresh start. But as strange events unfold in his mansion, he begins to question everything, even the woman he loves. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Are you insane, Mr. Carter? Letting strangers into your home. The voice of Mrs. Hawthorne, Benjamin Carter's head housekeeper, cut through the tension in the grand foyer. She stood with arms crossed, her weathered face etched with disapproval. Beside her, two of the other staff members shifted uncomfortably, stealing glances at the newcomers who stood just inside the doorway, dripping from the cold. Benjamin exhaled, the long day weighing on him. His tailored suit was damp at the shoulders from the snow outside, but he didn't care. His gaze flickered toward Charles, the disheveled man standing beside his young son, Jacob. The boy clung to his father's coat, his thin frame trembling from the cold. "They need help, Mrs. Hawthorne." "I won't turn them away," Benjamin said, his voice steady. Charles, looking both grateful and wary, shifted uncomfortably. His brown eyes held a mix of pride and reluctance. "Sir, we don't want to be a burden. Just a warm place for the night." "You'll stay as long as you need to," Benjamin interrupted firmly. "No one should be out in this weather." The housekeeper's lips tightened, but she knew better than to argue with her employer when he had made up his mind. With a stiff nod, she turned on her heel. "I'll have a room prepared," she muttered. As she left, Benjamin's gaze softened as he crouched in front of Jacob, who had barely spoken a word. The child, no older than 6, had deep blue eyes that seemed too knowing for his age. "You okay, buddy?" Benjamin asked gently. Jacob only nodded, his small hands gripping his father's coat tighter. "I have a son myself," Benjamin offered. "He's grown now, but when he was your age he used to love hot chocolate. Would you like some?" The boy hesitated, then nodded again. "That's a yes," Benjamin chuckled before glancing at Charles. "Come on, let's get you both warmed up." The sitting room was dimly lit, a fire crackling in the grand stone fireplace. Evelyn Carter sat in her wheelchair by the warmth, a soft cashmere shawl draped over her frail shoulders. Her honey-colored hair, still glossy despite years of illness, cascaded in waves over her delicate frame. She turned her head as Benjamin wheeled himself beside her, her emerald eyes filled with curiosity. "You brought guests," she noted softly. Benjamin kissed her forehead before answering. "They needed shelter. I couldn't leave them out there." Evelyn's gaze drifted to Charles and Jacob, who stood uncertainly near the entrance of the room. Something unreadable flickered in her eyes before she offered a warm smile. "Welcome," she said gently. "Any friend of my husband's is a friend of mine." Charles dipped his head respectfully. "Thank you, ma'am. We won't impose for long, just until we get back on our feet." "Nonsense," Evelyn replied, her voice carrying surprising strength. "You stay as long as you need." As she spoke, Jacob peeked out from behind his father. Evelyn's expression softened further. "Hello there, sweetheart. What's your name?" "Jacob," the boy murmured. "Jacob." She repeated his name as if testing it on her tongue. "Well, Jacob, I hope you like stories because I have a whole library of them." The boy's eyes widened slightly. "Real ones?" Evelyn's smile grew. "Very real ones." Benjamin watched the exchange with quiet admiration. Even after everything, her paralysis, the countless hospital visits, the pain, Evelyn's kindness remained untouched. Yet, something about the moment unsettled him. For a brief second, Evelyn's eyes weren't on the child. They were on Charles. And in them, Benjamin thought he saw something akin to recognition. The mansion was unusually quiet that evening. Benjamin, exhausted from the day, retired to his study with a glass of whiskey. Outside, the wind howled against the massive windows, but his mind wasn't on the storm. It was on his wife. Had she met Charles before? Evelyn had said nothing outright, but Benjamin knew her better than anyone. The way she'd looked at the man, it wasn't suspicion. It was something deeper. Something she had chosen not to say. A knock on the study door broke his thoughts. "Come in." Charles stepped inside hesitantly, his worn-out boots making barely a sound on the expensive wood floors. "I just wanted to thank you again, sir," he said. "Most folks wouldn't have done what you did." Benjamin waved him off. "It's not a big deal. To you maybe. But to Jacob and me? It means everything." There was a sincerity in Charles's voice that made Benjamin believe him. For a moment they stood in silence, the fire casting flickering shadows along the bookshelves. Then, in a quieter voice, Charles added, "Your wife, she's very kind." Benjamin nodded. "She is." Charles hesitated. Then, How long has she been paralyzed? The question, though not unexpected, made something twist in Benjamin's gut. 5 years now, he answered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Doctors say there's little chance of improvement. But I don't care what they say, I believe she'll walk again someday. He glanced up just in time to see something flash across Charles's face. Something almost unreadable. What? Benjamin asked. Charles shook his head. Nothing. Just, it must be hard. For both of you. Benjamin studied the man's face. There was something about the way he spoke, like he knew more than he was saying. But before Benjamin could press further, Charles offered him a small, grateful nod and turned to leave. Good night, Mr. Carter. As the door clicked shut, Benjamin leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire. Something didn't sit right. He just wasn't sure what. At 2:47 a.m., Benjamin stirred awake. Something was off. Years of running a business had made him a light sleeper. He was trained to wake at the slightest disturbance. And now, even in the heavy silence of his mansion, something prickled at his instincts. Slowly he sat up in bed, careful not to wake Evelyn. He listened. Footsteps. Light. Careful. Not from the guest rooms. From the hallway outside Evelyn's door. Benjamin's breath slowed. His heartbeat quickened. Swinging his legs over the bed, he moved soundlessly toward the door, pressing his ear against it. The footsteps stopped. He opened the door. No one was there. But the faintest whisper of fabric brushing against wood trailed down the hallway. And Evelyn's wheelchair, previously beside the bed, was slightly out of place. Benjamin's blood ran cold. He didn't know why. But for the first time since allowing Charles and Jacob into his home, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Unease. Benjamin Carter woke to a sense of unease. He couldn't place it at first, just a feeling in his gut, something unshakable, like a whisper of danger curling around the edges of his mind. Then he noticed Evelyn's wheelchair. It wasn't where it should be. It had been parked beside their bed the night before. Now it was 3 feet away, angled toward the door. Benjamin sat up slowly, rubbing his face. Maybe Evelyn had moved it slightly with her hands. Maybe it had just rolled a little on its own. Maybe. But something about it nagged at him. He glanced toward Evelyn. She was still asleep, her breathing soft and even. The firelight from the fireplace cast shadows along her face, making her look fragile, too delicate to be at the center of the strange things that were beginning to happen in their home. With a quiet sigh, Benjamin slid out of bed and repositioned the wheelchair where it had been before. He told himself it was nothing. But the unease wouldn't leave him. At breakfast, the air in the mansion felt different. Benjamin couldn't explain why, but it was as if the house itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Hawthorne set a plate of eggs and toast in front of him with her usual precision, but her lips were pursed. It didn't take much to tell she was uneasy too. Sir, she finally spoke, her voice low. Has someone been moving things in the house? Benjamin froze mid-bite. He swallowed carefully, setting his fork down. Why do you ask? The housekeeper hesitated, glancing toward Charles and Jacob, who were sitting at the far end of the table. Jacob was playing absent-mindedly with his spoon, while Charles sipped his coffee, avoiding eye contact. I've noticed things out of place, Mrs. Hawthorne continued in a near whisper. The kitchen stools aren't where I left them at night. The library door was unlocked this morning, though I swear I locked it before bed. And last night, she lowered her voice further, I heard footsteps in the hall. But when I checked, there was no one there. Benjamin frowned. The mansion was large, old, and prone to creaks, but footsteps? You're certain? He asked, keeping his voice even. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded. I don't make mistakes, sir. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. It wasn't just the wheelchair. There were too many little things happening now. Things he couldn't explain. And then there was the way Charles kept avoiding his gaze. That evening, Benjamin headed to his study to clear his mind. A stack of unread reports from work sat on his desk, but he couldn't bring himself to focus on them. Instead, his thoughts kept circling back to the unease in the mansion, the strange displacements, the silent tension, the feeling that someone was watching even when no one was there. Sighing, he decided a drink might help. He stepped into the hallway toward the kitchen, but just as he neared the trash bin near the counter, something caught his eye. A crumpled piece of paper. Something about it made him pause. It wasn't one of his receipts or notes. It had familiar lettering. He reached down, unfolded it carefully, and his stomach clenched. It was a prescription slip. For medication Evelyn didn't take. Benjamin stared at the paper, his mind clicking through the possibilities. The prescription was recent, filled just 2 days ago. Evelyn didn't take this medication. He had been handling her medical care for years. He knew every single pill, every dosage, every doctor's name. So, who did this belong to? His first instinct was Charles. But then why would Charles throw it away in their kitchen trash bin, as if he didn't care if someone found it? Benjamin turned the paper over in his hands, feeling the weight of it grow heavier. Something wasn't right. That night, Benjamin couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. The wheelchair, the misplaced objects, the prescription, and then, the whispers. He heard them just outside the bedroom door, soft, childlike murmurs, almost like a lullaby being hummed. Benjamin sat up, listening carefully. The sound was faint, but it was there. He slipped out of bed, moved toward the door, and slowly cracked it open. Jacob stood in the dimly lit hallway, his small frame barely visible in the flickering glow of a nightlight. Jacob. Benjamin's voice was quiet but firm. The boy turned, his blue eyes wide. He wasn't startled. He looked as if he had been waiting. "What are you doing up?" Benjamin crouched to his level. "It's late, buddy." Jacob hesitated before answering. His voice was barely above a whisper. "There's someone else here." Benjamin's blood turned to ice. "What do you mean?" Jacob bit his lip. "At night, I hear them. They walk around." He looked past Benjamin toward Evelyn's room. "Sometimes I think they go in there." Benjamin stiffened. "Who?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't know." His voice dropped lower. "But they don't like being seen." For a long moment, Benjamin just stared at the child. Jacob wasn't lying. There was no mischief in his face, no glint of imagination. And yet, there was something more. Something Jacob wasn't saying. Benjamin forced himself to stay calm. "You've seen them?" Jacob hesitated. "I think so," he finally whispered. "But only when I close my eyes. Like a shadow. Moving in the dark." The air around them felt thicker. Benjamin swallowed, a knot tightening in his stomach. He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "If you ever see them again," he said carefully, "you tell me right away, okay?" Jacob nodded, his small fingers curling into the fabric of his pajama shirt. Benjamin let out a slow breath, trying to steady his own thoughts. He had come into the hallway expecting to send a child back to bed. Instead, he was left with the cold certainty that something was wrong in his home. And now, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to know the truth. The tension in the mansion had grown thick, suffocating. Every shadow in the hallways felt longer, every sound at night seemed louder. Benjamin Carter barely spoke at breakfast, his eyes flicking toward Charles every so often. The man kept his head down, focused on his coffee, while Jacob absent-mindedly played with his food. Evelyn sat quietly, gazing out the window as if lost in thought. Something wasn't right. Benjamin didn't have proof, but his instincts, the same instincts that had made him a successful businessman, told him something was happening behind his back. He just didn't know what. It wasn't until later that morning when he decided to inspect the guest room that he found the keys. At first it was nothing. He had been passing by the room when he noticed the closet door slightly ajar. Frowning, he stepped inside. The guest room was simple, furnished but impersonal. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn back to let in the dull winter light. But something about the closet caught his attention. Benjamin pulled the door open fully, scanning the shelves. Nothing unusual. Extra linens. A few suitcases that Charles had brought with him. Then he noticed it. Tucked into the back corner of the shelf, barely visible under a folded sweater, was a small black pouch. Benjamin hesitated only for a second before pulling it out. The fabric was rough between his fingers, like it had been handled 1,000 times before. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. A set of keys. Cold metal glinted in the morning light, at least 5 different keys, old and worn, their purpose unknown. Benjamin's heart began to pound. Why would Charles need these? And more importantly, what did they open? That night, Benjamin didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Waiting. Jacob's words from the night before still echoed in his mind. "There's someone else here. They don't like being seen." The mansion was silent at first. Only the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. The faint sound of the wind outside. Then, at exactly 2:14 a.m., Benjamin heard it. A soft, deliberate movement. It wasn't the shifting of the house or the wind against the windows. It was footsteps. They were slow, measured. Someone walking just beyond the door of his bedroom. Benjamin sat up, pulse hammering. Evelyn didn't stir. Carefully, he swung his legs over the bed and stepped toward the door, moving as silently as possible. He placed his hand on the knob and turned it. Nothing. The hallway was empty. but the air was heavy, like someone had just been there. Benjamin clenched his jaw and stepped into the corridor. The dim glow from a night light near the staircase barely illuminated the long hall. He listened, his ears straining against the silence. Then a creak. From the guest room. Benjamin moved, each step precise and controlled. He reached the door and placed his hand on it, feeling the wood tremble slightly as if someone was shifting inside. Slowly, carefully he turned the knob. The door swung open. The room was empty. But the closet door, the same one where he had found the keys earlier, was slightly ajar again. Benjamin took a deep breath and approached, his heart thudding against his ribs. He pushed the closet door open fully. Empty. The black pouch was gone. The next morning Benjamin didn't wait. He found Charles in the library reading a worn-out book. Jacob was on the floor nearby, sketching in a notebook. The boy looked up briefly as Benjamin entered but quickly returned to his drawing. Charles, however, stiffened. "You were up late last night?" Benjamin said casually. Charles's fingers tightened around the book. "Couldn't sleep." Benjamin nodded, taking slow steps forward. "That so?" "Because I heard someone walking around." Charles glanced toward Jacob before speaking. "It's an old house, Mr. Carter. Houses creak." Benjamin didn't blink. "And do old houses also leave keys hidden in closets?" The room went silent. Jacob stopped drawing. His little shoulders tensed. Charles's expression darkened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Benjamin pulled the black pouch from his pocket and tossed it onto the table in front of Charles. The man stared at it, his jaw tightening. Jacob looked between them, then suddenly clutched his father's sleeve. "Dad," he whispered. "It's fine, Jacob," Charles murmured, his voice strained. Benjamin leaned forward. "Where did you get these?" Charles was tense, his fingers twitching slightly as if fighting the urge to snatch the keys back. "I found them," he finally muttered. "Where?" "In the basement." Benjamin's brows furrowed. "The basement is locked." Charles hesitated. "I found a way in," he admitted. "But I wasn't stealing. I needed to check something." "Check what?" Charles looked toward Jacob again. The boy was staring hard at the floor, refusing to meet Benjamin's gaze. "There's something wrong with this house, Mr. Carter." Benjamin frowned. "What do you mean?" Charles swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I think something is still down there." That afternoon, Benjamin went to Evelyn. She was in the sunroom, her wheelchair positioned near the windows. The light framed her delicate features, but something about her looked distant. "You're quiet today," Benjamin observed. Evelyn smiled, but it was faint. "Just tired." Benjamin sat beside her. For a moment, they simply watched the wind rattle the bare trees outside. Finally he spoke. "Charles said there's something wrong with the house." Evelyn stiffened. It was subtle, but Benjamin caught it. "What do you think?" he pressed. She was silent. "Evelyn." She turned to face him, her green eyes unreadable. "I think," she hesitated. "I think Charles is afraid of something." Benjamin leaned in. "And what about you? Are you afraid?" A long pause. Then, finally, she whispered, almost too softly to hear. "I don't know anymore." Benjamin left the sunroom feeling more unsettled than before. Charles was nervous. Evelyn was distant. And Jacob? Jacob wasn't scared. No, Jacob was waiting. For what, Benjamin didn't know. But the weight of fear in the mansion was growing. And whatever was lurking in the dark was getting closer. Benjamin Carter had reached his limit. The unease, the whispers, the missing keys, none of it made sense. His home, once a place of order and control, was becoming a breeding ground for secrets. And now Evelyn was distant. His wife, the woman he had dedicated the last 5 years to caring for, was keeping something from him. So he did what any man backed into a corner would do. He installed cameras. It was easy. The mansion was old, but technology wasn't beyond its reach. Small, discreet cameras hidden in key areas of the house. The library, the hallways, the sitting room, Evelyn's bedroom. A part of him hated himself for it. But a bigger part, the part that refused to be blind any longer, pushed aside the guilt. He needed to know. And when the clock struck midnight, he sat in his office, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold beside him, and watched. For the first 2 hours, nothing. Mrs. Hawthorne passed through the hallway once, checking the locks like she did every night. Charles didn't leave his room. Jacob, as far as Benjamin could tell, slept soundly. Then at 2:31 a.m. movement. Benjamin leaned forward, his breath slow and measured. The feed from Evelyn's bedroom flickered slightly before clearing. And there she was, his paralyzed wife, standing, walking. moving effortlessly across the room. Benjamin's heart slammed against his ribs. He froze, his mind refusing to register what his eyes were seeing. Evelyn, his Evelyn, moved with such grace, such precision, as if she had never spent a day in that wheelchair. She walked to the dresser, opened the top drawer and pulled something out. A small notebook. Then, as if sensing something, she stopped. For a full minute she didn't move. Benjamin held his breath. Then without warning she turned. Not toward the door. Toward the camera. Straight at it. As if she knew it was there. Benjamin's stomach clenched. For the first time in his life he felt cold terror in his own home. Then a noise, the sound of distant footsteps. Evelyn's head snapped toward the door. And just as quickly as she had stood, she rushed back to her wheelchair, positioned herself perfectly and went still. As if nothing had happened. Benjamin didn't know how long he sat there staring at the screen. The footage looped, replaying over and over, but his mind refused to accept it. She had been lying to him. Not for days. Not for weeks. For months. The implications hit like a freight train. Every sacrifice. Every moment he spent worrying, taking care of her, fighting for her. And she had been walking all along. His hands curled into fists. He had loved her. He still did. But this was betrayal. What? Why would she do this to him? 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind, each one sharper than the last. Had she planned this from the start? Had she enjoyed watching him break himself for her? No, that wasn't Evelyn. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't heartless. But then why? Benjamin reached for his whiskey, his fingers trembling slightly as he poured himself a glass. The amber liquid barely settled before he downed it in one go. He needed to confront her. But not yet. Not like this. Not while rage and confusion warred inside him. The sun rose, but the weight in Benjamin's chest remained. Evelyn was already in the sitting room when he came downstairs, sipping tea, her chair facing the window. She looked peaceful. Too peaceful. As if she weren't living a lie. "Morning, darling," she greeted him with a soft smile. Benjamin forced a smile back. How easily she lied. "Morning," he replied, his voice carefully controlled. He needed to tread carefully. He needed answers. And Evelyn, his wife, his love, the woman who had deceived him, was going to give them to him. One way or another. Benjamin Carter wasn't a man who rushed into conflict. His business instincts had trained him well. Wait, observe, strike only when necessary. But this wasn't business. This was his wife. The woman he had given everything for. And she had lied to him. He watched her as she sat near the window, sipping tea like nothing had changed. The same woman he had spent years pushing in that damn wheelchair, believing she needed him. The memory of the footage replayed in his mind like a nightmare. Evelyn standing, moving freely, walking across the room like she had never been paralyzed. The betrayal cut deeper than he thought possible. He couldn't keep it in anymore. "So how long were you planning on keeping up the act?" Evelyn froze. The teacup trembled slightly in her hands, the only sign of her guilt. Slowly she turned, her green eyes wide and unreadable. "What?" Benjamin stepped forward, fists clenched. "I know, Evelyn." His voice was eerily calm, too calm. "I saw you." Her lips parted, but no words came. "I saw you walking." For a moment there was nothing. No excuses. No denials. Just silence. Then her breath hitched and Benjamin saw it. The wall she had carefully built began to crack. "Ben. Don't," he snapped, sharper than he intended. "Don't lie to me. Not now." Evelyn's eyes shone, but she blinked rapidly as if refusing to let the tears fall. "I can explain." "Then explain," Benjamin challenged, his heart pounding. "Tell me why I've spent the last 5 years watching you suffer, taking care of you, believing." He swallowed hard, his voice breaking slightly. "Believing you needed me." Evelyn flinched as if his words physically hurt her. Then she broke. "I was afraid," she whispered. Benjamin scoffed. "Afraid of what? Afraid I'd find out? Afraid I'd stop caring about you if you could walk?" "No," she cried, shaking her head. "That's not it." She reached for his hand, but he stepped back. Evelyn's lip trembled. "I started regaining movement months ago," she admitted, her voice so low it was barely above a whisper. "At first it was just little things. I could twitch my toes, move my legs slightly in bed. But then, I got stronger." She inhaled shakily. "But the last time that happened, I lost it all again." Benjamin frowned. "What?" Evelyn looked away, shame written all over her face. "It happened before, Ben. A year after the accident. The doctors thought I was improving. I even stood on my own a few times, but then one morning I woke up and her breath hitched. It was all gone. She gripped her shawl like it was the only thing keeping her together. "I watched you go through hell," she whispered. "You were devastated. And her voice broke. "I couldn't do that to you again." Benjamin felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. He staggered back, staring at her as if he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. "So you decided to keep it a secret?" His voice was rough, filled with something he couldn't name. "You decided to let me believe." He ran a hand over his face, trying to make sense of it. Trying to make sense of her. "It wasn't just for you," Evelyn insisted. "I was terrified. What if I relapsed again? What if I gave you hope only to take it away?" Her hands clenched into fists. "I thought if I could be sure, if I could heal completely first," she let out a shaky breath, "then I could tell you. Then it would be real." Benjamin's heart ached, but the hurt was still too fresh. "You should have told me," he said quietly. Evelyn let out a soft, broken laugh. "I know." And for the first time since this nightmare began, she started to cry. Neither of them noticed the presence in the doorway. Charles stood frozen, his expression unreadable. But it wasn't shock. No, Benjamin knew shock. This was something else. Recognition. "How long have you known?" Benjamin's voice was cold as he turned to the other man. Charles blinked, snapping out of whatever daze he was in. He hesitated, then sighed. "A while." Benjamin's jaw tightened. "How long?" Charles hesitated. "Since before we came here." Benjamin's stomach dropped. "You knew?" Charles exhaled slowly. Too slowly. "I suspected," he admitted. "At first I thought I was imagining it. Little things. The way she carried herself, the way she held tension in her body, those aren't things someone with complete paralysis does." He glanced at Evelyn, something unreadable in his eyes. "But then I started noticing more." Benjamin felt like the room was spinning. "Why didn't you say anything?" he demanded. Charles's jaw clenched. "Because it wasn't my secret to tell." The words felt like a slap. Benjamin turned back to Evelyn, his chest aching with betrayal, grief, and something else, something he couldn't name. "How many people were supposed to know before I did?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Evelyn's breath hitched. "Ben." "No," he cut her off. "You should have told me. You owed me that." And then, unable to look at either of them any longer, Benjamin turned and walked out. His wife's sobs followed him down the hall. Benjamin didn't know where he was going. The mansion was too big, too suffocating. He walked aimlessly through the halls, trying to make sense of everything. Trying to make sense of her. He had spent years mourning the life they lost. The life she lost. And all this time she had been getting it back without him. The pain burned. Because in the end it wasn't just about the lie. It was about the fact that she hadn't trusted him enough to share the truth. And Benjamin didn't know if he could forgive that. Benjamin wasn't a man who tolerated deception. Yet here he was, the fool in his own home, surrounded by lies. Evelyn had betrayed him with silence. But Charles? Charles had known. And he said nothing. Benjamin needed answers. And he would get them. Benjamin's first move was to investigate. Charles had come into his life as a homeless man, desperate, lost. But something had always felt off. So Benjamin called in a few favors. And what he discovered was worse than he imagined. Charles wasn't just some drifter. He was a former physical therapist. And he had been disgraced. That evening, Benjamin found Charles alone in the library, flipping through an old medical book. How fitting. Benjamin didn't wait. "Who are you really?" His voice cut through the quiet. Charles's fingers twitched against the page, but he didn't look up. "I think you already know." Benjamin stepped closer. "You worked as a physical therapist. You lost your license. What happened?" Finally, Charles looked up. "A mistake." Benjamin scoffed. "Be specific." Charles sighed, setting the book aside. "I was treating a patient. Someone I believed in. Someone who was told they'd never walk again." His eyes flickered. "She did. And then she didn't." Benjamin stilled. "Evelyn." Charles nodded. "I was there when she was first diagnosed." "You knew my wife?" "I treated her." Charles's voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes. "I saw her struggle. I saw her improve. And then, when she relapsed, I saw the system fail her." Benjamin clenched his jaw. "So you just happened to show up here?" Charles shook his head. "No. I saw her again. Years later. And I knew I had to help. You should have told me. Would you have let me?" Benjamin opened his mouth to respond, but the truth stopped him. No. He wouldn't have. He would have demanded control. He would have micromanaged every session, forcing results. And that would have broken Evelyn more than silence ever could. "Why did you hide it from me?" Benjamin asked, his voice quieter now. Charles looked down. "Because healing is fragile." Benjamin felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years fighting for Evelyn. And yet, in his desperation to keep her safe, had he become her cage? Charles continued, his voice almost a whisper. "She wasn't ready to tell you, Benjamin. She was afraid of what it would do to you. And maybe I was too." Benjamin swallowed hard. For the first time he understood. It didn't make it hurt less. But it made sense. The mansion was filled with ghosts, not of the dead, but of secrets long buried. And now it was time to face them. The night was still. Too still. Benjamin Carter lay awake, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him like a suffocating fog. Evelyn's deception, Charles's confession. It was too much. His home, his sanctuary, had turned into a labyrinth of secrets. And then, just as sleep threatened to claim him, the alarm went off. A high-pitched, shrill wail that shattered the silence of the mansion. Benjamin bolted upright. Something was wrong. He threw on his robe and sprinted down the hallway, his heart hammering as doors creaked open around him. Charles emerged from the guest room, already alert. "Jacob," Charles said, his voice tight. Benjamin's breath caught. The boy's room was empty. The sheets were pushed aside, his small shoes missing from the bedside. The window, unlocked. "Where is he?" Charles rasped, panic creeping into his voice. Benjamin turned toward the security office. The cameras. If something happened, they would show it. He moved faster than he had in years, shoving open the security room door, Charles on his heels. He yanked up the most recent footage and rewound it to the last 5 minutes. The screen flickered and then, there. Jacob, stepping into the hallway, moving cautiously, but he wasn't alone. A figure loomed beside him. Not Evelyn. Not Charles. Not anyone Benjamin recognized. "Who the hell is that?" Charles whispered. The figure was tall, covered in shadows, their face obscured. They didn't touch Jacob, but the boy followed them, as if in a trance. Then the footage glitched. When the screen cleared, they were both gone. Chaos erupted in the mansion. Mrs. Hawthorne roused the staff, flashlights flickering against the walls as they searched every inch of the house. "Jacob." Charles's voice cracked as he checked under beds, inside closets, behind furniture. Evelyn, now fully alert, wheeled herself into the hallway, her face pale. "He's still here," she murmured, gripping the arms of her wheelchair. Benjamin turned to her sharply. "How do you know?" She exhaled, looking toward the floor. "Because I felt it too." Benjamin didn't have time to unpack that. "Then we find him. Now." He and Charles rushed down the halls, the echo of their footsteps merging with the frantic energy of the house. Rooms turned up empty. The attic? Nothing. The garden? No footprints in the snow. And then, wait. Charles stopped short, eyes narrowing at the basement door. It was open. Just slightly. Just enough for a child to slip through. A chill ran down Benjamin's spine. "He's down there." The old wooden steps groaned under their weight as they descended. The basement was vast. Storage boxes, old furniture, forgotten heirlooms. A place filled with dust and things left behind. Benjamin's flashlight flickered across the walls. Nothing. Then, a small noise. A whimper. "Jacob." Charles called out. Silence. Then, "I'm here." The voice was small, shaky. Benjamin turned the flashlight toward the farthest corner, behind an old wooden wardrobe. And there he was. Jacob curled up, trembling. Charles rushed forward, dropping to his knees. "Jacob, my boy, what happened? What were you doing?" Jacob didn't look up. He clutched his small hands around his arms, his body rigid. I followed them," he whispered. "Who?" Benjamin pressed, kneeling beside him. Jacob's blue eyes were wide, unblinking. "The person in the house." Benjamin's breath hitched. "You mean Evelyn?" Charles asked, but Jacob shook his head violently. "No." A long, trembling pause. "It wasn't her. It wasn't any of you." The room seemed to shrink. The air turned cold. "Jacob," Benjamin said slowly, carefully. "Who have you been seeing?" Jacob swallowed hard. His gaze flickered toward the shadows behind them. Someone else. Benjamin's heartbeat pounded in his ears. The real stranger. The shadowy figure. "They live here too," Jacob whispered. The light flickered. A draft curled through the basement, sending a shiver down Benjamin's spine. Something wasn't right. Something was still here. Watching. Waiting. And now Benjamin knew it. Benjamin Carter stood in the dimly lit basement, his breath slow and measured. The weight of Jacob's words lingered in the air. They live here too. A stranger. A presence unknown to them all. But who? The mansion had been in Benjamin's family for decades, passed down through generations. He had lived there for years thinking he knew every inch of the place. And yet he didn't. Not really. Something was here. Something older than him, older than Evelyn's illness, older than the life they had built. And it was time to find out what. The following morning, Benjamin combed through every document he could find about the mansion's past. Old blueprints, property records, historical archives. It took hours, but then, something strange. An architectural discrepancy. The official records showed a sealed-off section of the basement, a room that no longer existed. Except, it had to be there somewhere. Benjamin grabbed a flashlight, ignoring the concerned looks from Charles and the staff as he made his way back to the basement. He pressed his hands along the stone walls, searching, feeling. Then a shift. One brick was looser than the others. Benjamin pushed and something clicked. A draft of cold, stale air slithered through a narrow gap. A hidden door. His pulse quickened as he pressed harder. The old wood groaned as it scraped against the stone floor, revealing a passageway beyond. A room lost to time. Dust hung thick in the air as Benjamin stepped inside. His flashlight flickered over cobweb-covered shelves, rusted metal, and stacks of old documents. And then, the medical equipment. He stopped cold. 4 stands. Restraints. A cracked examination table covered in brittle leather straps. His stomach churned. This wasn't just an old storage room. It was a clinic. No, not just any clinic. A rehabilitation facility. And it had been hidden right under their feet. Benjamin sifted through the crumbling papers on the desk, his fingers brushing against faded photographs and handwritten notes. A name appeared repeatedly. Dr. Albert Whitmore. Benjamin frowned. He had never heard the name before. A former owner of the house? He turned to an old yellowed patient file. The ink had faded, but he could still make out fragments of the text. Subject responds well to shock therapy. Motor function shows brief restoration. His throat tightened. Shock therapy? For physical rehabilitation? His eyes scanned further. Prolonged treatments cause unpredictable relapses. Patients exhibit resistance to long-term progress. Treatment remains experimental. Benjamin's breath hitched. This wasn't rehabilitation. It was human experimentation. The room wasn't just a forgotten clinic. It was a place of cruelty, and someone had kept it hidden. Then a final detail sent ice through Benjamin's veins. Another name, one buried in the fine print of patient records. Evelyn Carter. His wife. His vision blurred as he skimmed the page, his hands shaking. Evelyn had been treated here. In this room. Years ago. Long before she had moved into the mansion with him. Long before she had been diagnosed. Benjamin staggered back, his mind racing. This couldn't be a coincidence. Had she known? Had Dr. Whitmore's methods, however twisted, been responsible for her sudden, secret recovery? And if so, who was keeping these secrets buried? A sharp sound snapped him back to the present. A floorboard creaked above him. Benjamin's breath stalled. Someone else was in the house. And now they knew he had found the truth. Benjamin stood frozen in the hidden room, the weight of history pressing against his chest. Dr. Albert Whitmore. A man he had never known. A man whose twisted hands had shaped his wife's suffering long before Benjamin ever entered her life. And yet, the truth, the horrifying, inescapable truth, was that this house, his house, had belonged to Whitmore. And his work had never left. Above him, a floorboard creaked. Someone was there. Watching. Waiting. Benjamin's grip tightened around the flashlight, his breath slow and controlled. He turned off the beam and slipped out of the hidden room, pressing himself against the cold stone wall. A shadow passed along the staircase leading down to the basement. And then a whisper. Not words. A breath. Benjamin lunged. The shadow moved. Fast. Benjamin caught a glimpse of something. A figure, tall, draped in darkness, slipping through the open basement door. Gone. His pulse thundered. He turned on his heel and rushed upstairs. He needed answers. Evelyn sat in the dimly lit sitting room, the soft glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across her face. She had been waiting. Benjamin didn't sit. He stood across from her, staring, daring her to lie to him again. Tell me the truth. Evelyn's fingers curled against the blanket draped over her lap. You already know it, she whispered. Say it. She swallowed hard, her emerald eyes glistening. It started months ago, she admitted. At first I thought it was nothing, a dream, a sensation. But then, I felt it. Benjamin clenched his fists. Felt what? Evelyn's voice trembled. Something guiding me. At night. Moving my arms, my legs. It wasn't just therapy, Benjamin. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. She looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers. I would wake up and find myself in different positions, standing one night, sitting another. Felt unnatural. Like something was urging me to move. Benjamin exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. Why didn't you tell me? Her lip quivered. Because I didn't know if I was crazy. Silence. Benjamin closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. Everything was falling apart. And just when he thought he had finally unraveled the worst of it, I knew about Whitmore. Benjamin's eyes snapped open. Evelyn met his gaze, the guilt unmistakable. Not everything. But I remembered his face. His voice. I remember the treatments, Benjamin. I remember the pain. Benjamin felt like the floor had vanished beneath him. You never told me. Evelyn wiped at her tears. I didn't want to remember it myself. A cough sounded from the doorway. Benjamin turned. Charles. He stood there, his face shadowed, eyes heavy. I need to tell you something, he said. Benjamin let out a hollow laugh. Of course you do. Because clearly, I'm the last damn person to know anything in my own house. Charles took a slow step forward. I wasn't just a therapist. Benjamin's heart stopped. I was a patient too. Evelyn sucked in a sharp breath. Benjamin, however, was beyond shock. What are you talking about? Charles hesitated. I was part of Whitmore's trials. Benjamin frowned, the puzzle shifting in his mind. You were his patient? Charles nodded. I was paralyzed once too. Benjamin froze. Charles exhaled, rubbing a hand over his tired face. I was young. A soldier. A spinal injury left me unable to walk. The doctors told me there was no cure, that I'd never regain function. But Whitmore, he promised me something different. His voice darkened. He experimented on me. Shock therapy. Drug trials. Things that weren't approved, things no doctor should have been doing. And it worked. Benjamin asked. Charles gave a bitter smile. For a while. The room went cold. I walked again. For a few months. Then my body crashed. The pain, the spasms, my body rejected what he had done. It left me worse off than before. So I ran. Benjamin swallowed hard. So when you saw Evelyn? I knew. Charles nodded slowly. I saw the signs. The muscle memory, the way she reacted to certain movements. I knew she had been one of his patients too. But I also knew what would happen if she wasn't careful. Benjamin staggered back. It all made sense now. Charles hadn't just shown up at the mansion out of desperation. He had come out of guilt. But if Whitmore is long gone, Benjamin muttered, who the hell is still in this house? Charles went rigid. I don't know, he admitted. But I think someone else was involved in his work. Someone who never left. The words felt like ice in Benjamin's veins. Whitmore's treatments had been cruel, but they had been driven by science. Whoever was here now, they were hiding, watching, manipulating. And Jacob had seen them. They live here too. Benjamin squared his shoulders. No more lies. No more secrets. Whoever was in this house was about to be unmasked. And he wouldn't stop until the truth was dragged into the light. Benjamin Carter had spent his life believing in logic. Business was logical. Numbers were logical. But nothing about the past week had been rational. Secrets hidden in the walls. A forgotten doctor's experiments. His wife's betrayal. And now, a stranger living in his house. The pieces had finally started falling into place, but one question still remained. Who was the real stranger? He was about to find out. The mansion had been searched from top to bottom. But the hidden room had taught him a lesson. Not all doors were meant to be seen. There's only one place left, Charles muttered, standing beside Benjamin in the dim hallway. The servants' quarters? Charles shook his head. Beyond that, there's a crawl space behind the east wing. I checked the door before, thought it was locked from the inside. But if someone's been living there... Benjamin didn't wait. He moved. The east wing had been abandoned for decades, a relic of a time when the mansion housed dozens of staff. Dust coated the floors, but not enough. Someone had walked through recently. Benjamin reached the wooden door tucked behind the old storage units. It was barely visible under peeling wallpaper. He gripped the rusted handle and pushed. The door didn't budge. Damn it, he muttered, pressing harder. Then, a sound. A scuffle from the other side. Someone was in there. Open this door, Benjamin ordered, his voice sharp. Silence. Then a soft, rasping voice. Please, don't. His spine chilled. Who are you? A long pause. Then the lock clicked. The door creaked open, revealing the stranger. She was older, frail. Her hair was a dull gray pulled back into a loose bun. Deep wrinkles carved into her pale skin. Her eyes, dark and sunken, darted between them like a cornered animal. Benjamin recognized her from the old records. You worked for Whitmore, he said. She nodded slowly, her thin hands trembling. I was his nurse, she whispered. I was supposed to help. But she broke off, looking away. You stayed, Charles murmured, studying her. The woman, Nora Whitmore as the files had named her, let out a shaky breath. I never left, she admitted. After he was gone, I had nowhere to go. And this house, it was mine as much as his. I couldn't abandon it. Benjamin felt his stomach churn. So you watched us? Nora nodded. I watched, and I tried to help. Your wife, Evelyn, I knew her case. I knew what had been done to her. Evelyn, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. You adjusted my wheelchair. Nora's eyes softened. Yes. I had to make sure that you were still healing. Benjamin exhaled. The shadows in the hall. The misplaced objects. The unease. It had been her. Not a ghost. Not an intruder with ill intent. A woman burdened by a past she couldn't leave behind. The revelations changed everything. For Evelyn, the past wasn't as terrifying anymore. The unknown had a name now. For Charles, the guilt he carried began to ease. He hadn't been alone in his pain. Others had suffered. Others had endured. For Benjamin, trust had to be rebuilt. The next morning, he and Evelyn sat together for the first time in what felt like ages. No secrets. No lies. Just them. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive you, Benjamin admitted. Evelyn swallowed, nodding. I understand. Pause. Then softer. But will you try? Benjamin met her gaze. You wanted to? Yes. Her relief was visible. She reached for his hand. For the first time in years, he let her. Then we start again, she whispered. Together. Charles had been prepared to leave. But Benjamin wouldn't let him. You need to finish what you started, he told him. Go back to your work. Charles hesitated. You trust me as a therapist after everything? Benjamin nodded. You were never the problem, Charles. The past was. A beat. Then Charles let out a small, exhausted chuckle. I suppose it's time I stop running then? Jacob beamed. For the first time, the boy looked truly safe. We're staying? He asked, eyes bright. Charles ruffled his son's hair. Yeah, kid. We're staying. The mansion had once been a prison of the past. Now it was a place of healing. The hidden room was sealed for good. Nora left, finally at peace, knowing the past had been set to rest. And Benjamin? He stood beside Evelyn in the grand hall, the echoes of old pain slowly fading. We were afraid, Evelyn whispered. Benjamin turned to her, his voice stronger than it had been in years. Not anymore. Together they walked forward. Into a new beginning. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more gripping and emotional narratives. Your support means the world to us. Drop a comment below and let's discuss this incredible journey together.